Greetings and welcome. In this comparatively shorter video, I hope to introduce you to a very small, easy to read book. A book that even children can read with enjoyment as well as benefit. A book that I feel all those who are inclined even marginally in a spiritual way should be familiar with. It is a biography. I'm particularly fond of biographies and autobiographies because getting to know how great men and women in the past lived their life is an unfailing source of inspiration for me. So it will be for all of you. And therefore I set apart much of my time to reading biographies and autobiographies. Fortunately, there are not too many of them, but plenty of them. And I commend the reading of biographies and autobiographies to all of my viewers. And in the Indian context, we are familiar with the autobiography of Gandhiji, titled The Story of My Experiments with Truth. But that's not the book that I'm seeking right now to introduce to you. It's the biography of a French priest. His name is John Frederick Oberlin, Oberlin. John Frederick Oberlin. He served lifelong in a place called Walbach, Waldbach, in the French province of Alsace. So now, why does this very obscure priest inspire me? I'm pretty sure that virtually none of my viewers would be familiar with the name of John Frederick Oberlin. Oberlin, if you like, Oberlin, because he's not the kind of person who would be celebrated by the fashionable, cultured, civilized people of the world. Now, he assumed the responsibility for a parish situated in a very inaccessible region, a parish comprising entirely of very poor people, scattered over several hills. It was a hilly region. Poor people living in their hamlets, small houses, most of them illiterate. Almost every one of them depended entirely on agriculture. The land was not particularly fertile, so that agriculture was not a rewarding vocation, but they had nothing else to do. Therefore, in order to survive, they resorted to agriculture, and they did not know anything about the scientific way of cultivating their land, and therefore what their land yielded was meager. So in short, it was a community plunged in poverty and backwardness. There was no land, there was no road, there was no educational institution, there was no hospital worth talking about. People living on these 4 or 5 hills couldn't even communicate with each other socially for want of roads. Children were left to themselves, and the worship life itself was rather meager. And France in those as now was a Catholic country, but the people living in this region were Protestants, so they had that handicap as well at a time when sectarian passions were very high. And in fact, Protestants were in several regions of France persecuted in those days, and this constitutes the subject of the great Voltaire's book, celebrated book, which also I commend you, Treatise on Toleration by Voltaire. which deals with the persecution of a Protestant family of a Catholic who became a Protestant, how he had to pay dearly for his life, for his convictions. So John Frederick Oberlin takes charge of the people of this region because nobody else was really interested. And he begins to become a catalyst, not only for true worship, but for total development. That's precisely what I want to present to you. What a priest who is truly aware of his godly mission, a priest who understands the diverse scope, the larger scope of spirituality, the many frontiers of making the will of God prevail among the people he is called upon to serve. The tremendous difference for the better that a priest with a true sense of spiritual vocation can bring about through a proper exercise of his priestly or sacerdotal vocation is what is illustrated through the life of John Frederick Oberlin. And that's precisely why I commend this book. It's a very small book, 140 pages. You can finish it in just one day. The style of the book is very simple, understandable because it's written for children and particularly for Sunday school children. It was published in 1830 by the Sunday School Union of the United States of America. So you can understand how the book was written. Now, what I propose to do now is to read maybe 2 or 3 paragraphs from this book and maybe offer 1 or 2 very brief observations or thoughts thereafter. I read from the book. It is the injunction of the apostle that whether we eat, he's referring to St. Paul, it is the injunction of the apostle that whether we eat or drink or whatsoever we do all to the glory of God. The reference is, of course, to the 10th chapter of the first letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians, verse 31. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 31. And I repeat that verse, whether we eat or drink or whatsoever we do all to the glory of God. And this was a verse that influenced John Frederick Oberlin a great deal. So what was the consequence thereof? See, that's something I seek to underline, because we also know these passages, but these are mere words to us. And our knowledge of these words, these exhortations, does not result in corresponding action or conduct on our part. Therefore, our spiritual life is weakened by the growing or increasing gulf between knowledge and action, or belief and behavior, or theory and practice. We know a lot of things, but none of the things that we know is brought into practice. So look at the impact of these words of St. Paul on Reverend Oberlin. The views of religion which Oberlin entertained made him follow this rule to its greatest extent. For example, he would take a stone out of the road if it were likely to incommode a traveler. Incommode means cause inconvenience to, or cause a traveler to stumble. Incommode. So he would take a stone out of the road if it were likely to incommode a traveler, on the principle of love to his neighbor. So how do you love your neighbor? In those days, people mainly traveled on foot, so they had regard for each other. So if Pastor Oberlin came across a stone on the way and he thought it was likely to inconvenience anybody who would come after him, he would bend down, pick that stone and put it aside. So on the principle of love to his neighbor, and in this manner he argued and practiced respecting all the duties in which mankind are engaged. In other words, spiritual ideas are not merely to be learned by way of gathering more and more knowledge, but each teaching is to be put to practice so that the beneficial effect of these teachings can be experienced by all. Now let me continue to read. He was charitable in all his opinions and feelings, and took every opportunity of teaching the duty of kindness to our fellow men without distinction. This is something that Christians in Kerala need to be particularly aware of. One morning, in the early part of his ministry, Mr. Oberlin was at work in his study. By the way, he set apart in the midst of an extremely busy pastoral life that he lived. He set apart a definite amount of time, 2 hours per day, to study. And this is something that would commend to all priests, because most priests that I know stop reading altogether the moment they are ordained and appointed to various congregations. He was at his study. He heard a great noise in the village. Going out, he found a crowd of people abusing a stranger with the most threatening language. A Jew, a Jew. See, in those days, Jews were very severely persecuted, many of them killed, all over Europe, and France was no exception. The great persecution of Jews that culminated in the Holocaust presided over by Hitler was not an isolated event. It was the tragic culmination of a long history of Jew baiting or Jew hating that characterized the European attitude to the Jews who lived among them as a Jewish diaspora. A Jew, they cried out on all sides as the pastor forced his way through them. It's the analog, it's a counterpart of the lynching with which we are familiar in our times. So substitute the Jew with a poor, defenseless Muslim who is accused of cow stealing or whatever, cow trade or whatever, eating the meat of cow, etc. And then you have a similar situation, right? So Pastor Oberlin, as he was at study, he hears this commotion. People encircling a man, shouting, a Jew. And then what did he do? He did not hide himself among his books. He ran out of his study and he plunged straight into the crowd. As soon as he could be heard, he rebuked them with warmth for having proved themselves unworthy of the name of Christians by treating the stranger in so cruel a manner. He added, and this is something particularly worthwhile to note. In fact, I would commend this to you to learn by heart and remember it all the time. He added that if this poor man wanted the name of a Christian, they wanted the spirit of Christians. The Jew whom they were persecuting, thrashing, beating up, he wanted, meaning he lacked the name of a Christian. But the Christians who were zealously tormenting him, they did not lack the name of Christians, but they lacked the spirit of Christians. It's a good illustration of the difference between nominal Christians and those who are Christians in spirit and truth. A Christian who is Christian in spirit and truth is one who follows Jesus Christ, his teachings, his role model, all his exhortations, and carries them into practice. Well, I can go on and read many more passages. Perhaps that's not necessary. I have given you a taste of this book. Particularly note that the style is very simple. The experiences dealt with are very close to our day-to-day experience. And it would be highly illuminating, encouraging, instructive, educational to read this book. Now, what I want to add now by way of a kind of epilogue, a reflection after the text epilogue, is this. One of the reasons why the priestly vocation has fallen upon evil days and has become so vulnerable to corruption, or the main reason why the priestly calling has lost its spiritual soul and is therefore increasingly alienated from what Jesus envisaged. The reason why a crisis of relevance stares in the face of priestly activities in general is this: that the priestly vocation is equated with a handful of priest crafts, ritualistic, dogmatic, doctrinal, stereotypical, all of which are conducted in a state of isolation from the way life is lived by the people. Whereas if you look at the teachings of Jesus Christ, all his teachings have an immediate reference to life. After all, he stated emphatically that the overarching purpose of his spiritual ministry was to lead people into life, and life in all its fullness. The one thing that the priestcraft is least mindful of is life, how life is lived by the people the priest pretends to look after. And they're supposed to be shepherds of the people. These are all expressions, the exact meanings of which remain in the realm of, in a state of twilight. These such expressions, such terminologies are moused without any regard as to what they actually mandate. Now suppose, following the example of Jesus Christ, or following the example of Pastor John Frederick Oberlin, a priest in the Kerala context, as he takes charge of a congregation, understands his ministry in this enlarged form of serving as a catalyst in the total life of the congregation, all members of the congregation, to stimulate them towards greater and higher qualities of life, exerting himself to the utmost in improving the state of affairs, the status quo as it were, identifying in particular what is lacking in the given context rather than trying to milk and massage the given context to one's pecuniary advantage. Trying to minister to each individual so as to bring out from that individual his or her latent potential so that each person grows to his or her possible full stature. In short, a priest who works with the vision that a congregation must become a place of growth for all people, growth in an all-round holistic manner, rather than understand one's vocation or one's duty merely as the routinized carrying out of certain ritualistic functions and certain stereotypical activities like parish visitations, the exact scope of which no priest is really bothered about. And the very profound and creative role a priest can actually play if he has any spiritual creativity in him, to bring about a tremendous and commendable difference for the better in the life of the people. Such a priest, I believe, is worthy of our utmost respect. And he would certainly be respected, valued, and his authority revered by every person without exception. And he would be a very convincing, compelling witness to the relevance of the way of Jesus Christ to contemporary life. But unfortunately, what happens is, most of the time, the scope of priestly ministry is equated with the mere habitual and therefore mechanical repetition of certain processes, rituals, practices, customs, traditions, and the repetition of certain ideas, the proclamation of certain patterns, all of which were set centuries ago. And because those things were felt to be of great value 500 years ago, 700 years ago, 1500 years ago, the same thing is being repeated without any heed to the fact that much water has flowed under the bridge time has moved on. Circumstances of life have changed so dramatically. And therefore, the condition in which people live is almost incredibly dissimilar to what it was when these litanies, rituals, customs, rites, practices were all formulated. And therefore, at least there is a need to adapt whatever has been inherited so that the essence, the spiritual essence, is retained in greater vitality and freshness. That would be the case if these rituals and rites are repeated in a mechanical fashion, utterly unmindful of the fact that greater and greater degrees of irrelevance is befalling these practices. And I say this particularly because of my concern for young people. A vast majority of the young people I know feel already alienated from church life because they feel that whatever is happening there is of no relevance to the life that they live, the challenges and the opportunities they face in their life. Young people are looking for relevance. They have a battle on their hands and they're looking for help, and they will be tremendously grateful and they will respect the authority of anyone who can provide some light that would illumine their paths. The old baggage is of no relevance to the young people, but unfortunately, because of the priestly obsession with the old baggage, what is of timeless value in the life, teachings, and role model of Jesus Christ is being obscured. And there is a terrible loss to all people, including the young people, young and old alike. And there is a need to bring about a change in this outlook. I believe that pastoral ministry or the priestly vocation can do good to the people provided it cares to renew itself in a true, spiritually valid and contextually relevant manner, which is a function of creativity. And I've always believed that spirituality, the quintessence of spirituality, is creativity. God is the creator, therefore creativity is an attribute of God, and therefore anyone who is godly will also be creative. And the quintessence of creativity is the power to transform the given. Now think of a sculptor. He takes a block of wood or a block of stone, he works at it. By the time he is done with it, he would have transformed that into an image of beauty, and with that, the value of the piece of stone or work or wood that he began with would have increased 10,000-fold. In one of my recent videos, I made a reference to the auction of Leonardo da Vinci's The Savior of the World painting, Salvator Mundi painting, which was auctioned at Christie's in London for $450 million, purchased by Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. So, my criticism of the priestly craft, my criticism of the priestly class is aimed at bringing about greater possibilities of good hidden in that line, to which unfortunately the priestly class as a whole remain, for whatever reasons, willfully, deliberately blind. I criticize only because I care. I criticize because I believe that a far greater, far more useful, and incomparably better job can be done of it. My cry is a cry for greater relevance, or as in the words of Jesus Christ, greater fruitfulness in the priestly vocation. And in that light, I thought, particularly the example of John Frederick Oberlin would be a source of inspiration. And let me close by making an appeal to parents, irrespective of which religion you practice. This is the kind of book that you should sit and read with your children, and if you have grandchildren, with them as well. Because Our children are growing up at a time when they lack good role models. They look here and there, but look in vain for good and inspiring role models. And therefore, we have to discover these role models from the past. Fortunately, there are plenty of them. And the best that parents can do, if they want to value educate their children, the best that grandparents can do, if they want to teach their grandchildren to walk in the path, the right path, as the book of Proverbs says, and the book of Psalms says, is to get them acquainted with the life of these great men and women. Because there is a great cynicism prevailing today about the feasibility of such idealistic attitudes to life. And this cynicism will serve as a poison from within. I sincerely believe that the worst tragedy that can happen to a human being is to be possessed by the spirit of cynicism, because that will paralyze all possibilities for good and reduce a person's life to utter aridity, barrenness, fruitlessness, and therefore self-revulsion. And this futility with which one is condemned to live for the rest of one's life, after this terrible tragedy of cynicism takes over you, is something far too unbearable. And I wouldn't like that to happen even to my worst enemies. So therefore, please try to protect your children, your grandchildren, and everybody within the area of your influence and responsibility from this most tragic of all global epidemics today, the epidemic, the pandemic of cynicism. And to that end, introducing your children to books of this kind that narrate the stories of inspiring examples of our fellow human beings who have blazed the trails in the past is perhaps the best you can do for your children. Therefore, once again, The Life of John Frederick Oberlin, published in 1830, written for Sunday school children that they may read and be inspired. Therefore, the style is simple, the substance is homely, the presentation is very, very easy, and it is something that I believe a school child today of the 5th standard, or from the 5th standard onwards, should be able to read with a little bit of guidance and help from parents or grandparents. So have a great time reading this book, and then also reading the book a second time with the ones that you really love. Thank you.